We have finally arrived, everyone. It's a 12-team playoff, and Notre Dame has made it to the finish line, 11-1, and in fine position to advance. Of course, hosting a playoff game against the Indiana Hoosiers. No one would have guessed that back in August, but here we are. In-state action, of course, in South Bend. Brian Driscoll, of course, here from Irish Breakdown to help us break down the Irish. Brian, how you doing?
I am doing great, man. Just getting ready for a playoff game. It's I think it's kind of I think that it's fitting that one of the quote unquote blue bloods is hosting that first game, right? I think that's the real big thing is I wanted to see one of those host, whether it's a Notre Dame or an Ohio State or a Penn State or, Georgia, something like that, Texas. So it's pretty cool that that's happening. I'm just ready to see it.
I think that also brings to light for a future episode after we're done watching football, the term blue blood. I know that one gets kicked around and various people have their definitions. Would love to hear yours. But we do have football.
Yeah. Yes,
so we don't need to get into that. That's a May topic. All right. The ranking, the seeding from top to bottom, and specifically Notre Dame, are you in line with the committee? Do you see any issues? Now, the seedings themselves and with the committee, to me, before I let you go on this topic, there's a difference between did the committee get it right with their rankings versus what happens to the seedings. They don't have any power over that. That's what the format is. That can be a different discussion, but in regards to the rankings, I had no real issues, although I do have one with Penn State in particular.
That's my big one. I mean, I think Texas would be the other one for me. I know Texas has looked really good at times this year against not great competition, but look, they had 2 chances to beat Georgia, both away from Athens, and they lost both times. That has to mean something more than just you fall out of 2 and go to the top, at large. I would have slid Texas and Penn State behind Notre Dame and Ohio State. That was really my only issue, Mark, was just the rankings. Like, I think they got the 12 right based on the rules, right? I mean, you've got to get Clemson in there. You get Arizona State in there, Boise in there. I think they got the 12 right. I don't think Alabama deserved a spot in the playoff this year the way it played out. I think they got the 12 right. I just would have moved Penn State and Texas below Notre Dame and Ohio State. I think those 2 teams are more dominant over the course of the season, have better wins. I just think they're better teams in every metric that you look at. They rank ahead of certainly Penn State. You could make a case for Texas because they've had some really dominant moments, but I certainly think Penn State should have fallen behind those 2 teams. And the fact that Texas blew a halftime lead to the backup quarterback, I think also is a little bit more of a black eye than if it would just been a normal 4-quarter plus overtime game. But that's really my only beef is that right there.
So comparing any of the teams that you just mentioned, those 4, the conversation's fairly nuanced. You got to go through all sorts of metrics or comparisons, good wins, bad losses, and do all that business, except for Ohio State and Penn State. That's what I don't understand, other than, of course, the committee stating before championship weekend that we are discarding these games. We are just going to, of course, as the format dictates, award the winner with the bye and with the conference championship and the automatic entry, but we are not taking into account the loser and that losing performance.
But they did, though. That's my frustration, right, Mark? Because they did that with SMU.
Yes.
They dropped SMU behind Indiana. So if you're going to drop SMU behind Indiana, why not drop Purdue, who literally never led in that game, right? I mean, that's the thing is they never led. It was only tied, 7-7. So yes, to your point, it's if you're going to do that, then do that. And that's why they kind of backed themselves into a corner with the SMU thing where if Clemson beat them, you're going to have to drop Alabama because you guys have set this precedent in what you've said. So I think it was an unforced error by Ward Manuel. He made a lot of those in his interviews, to be completely honest with you. He said a lot of things he either had to walk back or you're just well, that's ridiculous. But I said before the show started, Mark, that they were either going to jump Notre Dame up to 5 and knock SMU out because they were going to have to follow similar patterns. So if you're going to knock SMU out, then you need to jump Ohio State and Notre Dame ahead of Texas and Penn State, or they were going to leave Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, and Ohio State in order and then drop Bama out. And that's pretty much what they did. But if you're going to stay to that, then SMU should have been the 10 and Indiana should have been the 11. I'll be honest, as a Notre Dame fan, I'm glad it turned out the way that it did because I'd rather face Indiana than SMU. But just looking at it as a college football analyst, I either stay consistent or don't, right? And if you're going to be consistent, how does SMU losing on a walk-off field goal to the number 17 team in the country, result in them falling, but Texas blowing a second half lead to a backup quarterback, or Penn State literally never leading in the game? How does that justify them staying, but SMU falls behind a team that didn't play? It's just that's my issue.
Yes, for me, and I'm not saying that Texas is a clear-cut leader of this pack of four, but my rankings were Texas, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Penn State. That was my lineup of those four. And again,
it was Texas,
Notre Dame,
okay, Ohio State,
Penn State. And the direct comparison between Ohio State and Penn State is easy to make, of course. And it's not just the head-to-head. For me, there are 3 bullet points here to be considered. Number one, there is the head-to-head, especially on the road, especially game control considered. Again, it was a one-score game, but Ohio State was decidedly the better team. Point number 2, they go to Autzen Stadium, the Buckeyes. They lose by whatever you want to frame it, a point, a pass interference, a field, they're in field goal range to win the game if they get down in time to stop the clock. Versus Penn State, as you just laid out, that was an entertaining game. It was fun. There was a lot of offense, but Oregon held them at arm's length the entire game. It was never during that game did I think Penn State's going to win this game. It never crossed my mind. Was it possible? Of course, they got within range a few times, but it was a 2-score game most of the time.
It was like the Notre Dame Louisville game, right?
Yes.
I think you and I talked about that last week. It was a game where, Notre Dame won by a touchdown, but after the first quarter, you had that one fumble and Louisville scored, but like Notre Dame kind of quickly took control of that game, and you never really felt like Louisville was going to win. It just was, what's the margin going to be?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there's no comparison to me of how they both performed against the best team in the country or the best team on their schedules. And then point number 3, this is no fault of Penn State's, but Ohio State did play the other best team in the conference and beat them by 23 points. So that was my difference between those two. But again, I'm going Notre Dame ahead of those two.
And also, too, for Penn State, as we've talked about before, when you and I had that big Penn State discussion before, is they have a lot of ugly wins, in my opinion. Now, winning is winning, right? And so we're talking about splitting hairs between the 5 to 8 seed. So we're talking about all really good teams, but where should they be? One team has a 7-point win over Bowling Green. They have an ugly 21-7 win, and their only ranked opponent, whereas like a Notre Dame has a 35-point win over their ranked opponent. Ohio State has a dominant win, over some really good teams. You look at the USC game where they needed overtime. They, struggle with Wisconsin. They struggle with Minnesota. So they just haven't been as dominant as Texas. And then the only discussion for me between Texas, and there's 2 points that would give me pause about putting Texas ahead of Ohio State. And that is Texas's losses were better, both of them, meaning like Ohio State has the better one loss, and then the next 2 by far are Texas, and then the 4th loss that Ohio State has is a bad loss. And Texas played that team that beat Ohio State and beat them convincingly. But I think overall, I just look at Texas, and my concern about Texas is similar to the one that we use about Penn State. Is they've looked really good at times, but they've had some of their rough moments as well. But who'd they beat? That's the argument for Texas is. Their best win, for example, is Notre Dame's second best win, maybe third best win, Texas A&M. And those are the conversations you have. But the reality is, Marcus, all these resumes are somewhat flawed because they all have really big black eyes, either no good wins or really bad losses. And that was really what made, I think, the committee's job a little bit more challenging, is because you look at Bama on their best day and you're like, they can play with anybody. And then they're like, but there's other days where like they're a borderline top 25 team, if that, and I think that's what kind of factored a lot into this. But at the end of the day, I think the 12 that should be in there separated themselves when you talk about living within the realm of the 5 automatic bids.
It would have been interesting had SMU been smacked around by Clemson to see if they would have truly held to their word about not evaluating these games.
Let me ask you this, Mark, because this is why that comment is so dumb. If Clemson would have, let's say Clemson, it was 31-14, Clemson's in control. Let's say Clemson punches one more in and it's 38-14 and SMU gets a late score. It's a 38-21 game. Clemson controls from start to finish. Why should that not matter? Like, this is my whole problem. Why should that not matter?
They're playing football.
Right. And it's like, yeah, you don't want to punish them for being the ACC title game, but that's part of the deal. You signed up to be in this league. You could have stayed in the AAC, dominated the AAC, and you'd still be in. You actually, like, here's the thing with SMU. If they would have stayed in the AAC, they'd probably have a higher seed than they have now, because they would have dominated that league, right? And it's like, you chose to be a part of this league. You literally sacrificing tens of millions to be in this league. And this is the rules. These are the rules that you play by. And I'm just a believer, Mark, that if you get dominated in the regular season, you better have something real impressive, or even in the title game, you better have something real impressive on your resume to overcome that. And that, to me, is what hurt Ole Miss. That is what hurt Alabama. That is what hurt some of these teams. Fortunately for SMU, they were able to avoid that with that late comeback. So, your two losses were by combined 6 points. I think that helped them. But they should have got knocked out if Clemson would have just kept wailing on them the way that they had. They should have been knocked out, because this is an extension of the playoff. You're showing, do I belong or not? Like Penn State, for example, showed that they should not be a top 14. They showed that they should be closer to 7, 8, 9. But they still showed through the course of the season that they're one of the top 12, right? I mean, that's what we saw. But if they'd have gone out and let's say Oregon would have beat them by 30, well, do we really know that they're a top 12? You know what I mean? Like, that's the frustration with this. Is why should it, if it doesn't matter if you lose, it shouldn't really matter that you win. So why are we playing these games, period?
That's right.
Oh, that's right. We know why, Mark.
Well, that's ultimately every time I get a call from somebody who says, why are we expanding this playoff? Well, do you want to know the truth? Well, the truth is money.
Right.
Yeah, so I am there on everything that you just stated, but I do get the why are we potentially punishing championship game losers for putting their necks on the line, risking their reputation, while a third place team in the same conference is sitting at home with their resume intact and guarded, because all we have to do is look at the history of the 14 playoff and what the committee ranked championship game losers, many times safely within the 12, and then dropped them outside. Now, there was no playoff on the line, so we don't know how they would have treated that differently, but we know if they would have treated it the same, there would have been conference championship game losers knocked out of the playoffs. So I get that argument that let's not count this game, but it's football being played against one of the better opponents on your schedule that you're going to see this season. How do we, and to your final point, it's one of the points that I have consistently made. Well, the team that wins is being rewarded for the win, and that's being evaluated. How do you evaluate a football game and only evaluate the positive side of it and not the negative side?
I think for me, Mark, I'm not going to punish a team that plays in a conference title game against another good team, and it's a 4-quarter battle. Like, I would be willing to move teams around more than they did because it's the overall resume, but I'm not knocking SMU out for being in a close game. But you can't say we're not going to punish those teams at all, because you have to leave the opportunity for, if that team just goes out there and gets embarrassed on this kind of stage, that may show us something about their ability to go into this 12-team playoff and perform. So, it can't be absolute. It can't be, well, we're not going to punish them for being in the championship game. Okay, then why play them? But it's like, look, we're not going to have a major overreaction to a win or a loss that's competitive, where you showed you may have lost to Penn or Oregon, but Penn State showed in that game they're still one of the top 12, in my opinion, because they didn't quit. Like, that was actually one of the more impressive performances we've seen from Penn State, because they were down 28-10 and battled back and kept fighting, and that's what good teams do. But if SMU, if let's just say Oregon would have just piled on, or let's say they might be a bad example because Penn State was 3, but even there, Georgia went from 3 to 12 when they got blown out by Ole Miss. So why shouldn't Penn State go from 3 to 12 if they go out and get dominated by Oregon? And definitely SMU, if they'd have gotten beat by 3 touchdowns in Clemson in a game where not like let's say Notre Dame, USC doesn't score at the end of that Notre Dame game that's 49-28. That's a different kind of 21-point win because it was those 2 late pick sixes in a game that was a 1 touchdown game into the last 3 or 4 minutes. That's different than a 21-point win where you just get dominated for 60 minutes, right? I mean,
Sure.
You have to have some context to it. But if you go out there in your conference championship game and just get whipped, you just told us all that you're not a championship caliber football team. And so that's why it should not have been that blanket statement of, well, we're just not going to hurt. We're not going to punish you for losing that game. We're not going to punish you for showing that you're one of the better teams, but if you go out and get dominated, you should be out.
Context. You brought up context.
Right.
I often, as I'm sure you do, take all sorts of comments and questions and calls and so forth from people that are just throwing out scores that after listening to them talk, it's pretty apparent that they didn't watch the game. And how did we arrive at a 14-point?
Right.
As you know, there are 14-point games that were, wow, this was a barn burner, great game. It just happened to be a 7-point game, and then somebody got a late score that didn't matter, pick 6 or something, versus you were up 21-0 like that, and you just coasted and won by 14. And we're clearly the better team. So you mentioned that Indiana is a more favorable matchup for Notre Dame than SMU. Why?
Quarterback. I think about the type of quarterback that gives Notre Dame a problem compared to the type of quarterback in the end. But Mark, I'm a big believer in football that matchups matter. And it's just because one team is I may think one team is better overall as a team, but they match up better against this other team. So, for example, you're hearing a lot of, well, Texas stinks. Texas isn't very good. And I'm just like, no, Texas they're a bad matchup against Georgia. They're not a real physical football team. They're athletic, but they're not a team built around just, we watched Georgia just get ran on by UMass and Georgia Tech in back-to-back weeks because they went right at them. Well, that's not how Texas runs their run game. They're off tackle, counters, misdirection. Now you're playing right into Georgia's hands, right? It's a bad matchup. It's like in those 3-4 years where Dabo just was dominating the ACC, who's the only team to give him problems in the regular season? Syracuse and Dino Babers. Like, I don't know why it was that way, but that's just the way that it was, right? Like Pitt had that one random game where they beat them, but that's just the way that it is. It's like Hugh Freeze gave Nick Saban problems for a couple of years. So dominated the league, but couldn't beat Bo Wallace and Ole Miss. You know what I mean? Like, that's just how football is sometimes. It's a game of matchups. And when I look at Notre Dame and I look at what gives them a bigger concern for me, Indiana versus Notre Dame, or Indiana versus SMU compared to Notre Dame, they both run the ball well. They both have good backs. SMU has more of one good back, and Indiana's more of a 2-man group. Both have really good receiving cores. Both have veteran offensive lines. Both have better defenses than people think that they have, right? And both have really good quarterbacks that run their system well. Agreed with that overall analysis?
Oh, yeah.
Well, what gives Notre Dame a bigger problem? Is it the drop back pocket quarterback or the guy that can run around and make plays, just like the kid from USC was, right? He avoided 3 sacks that Miller Moss has no chance of avoiding, and he makes plays on him, right? Curtis Rourke, as we saw against Ohio State, if he can sit back in the pocket and have time, he's going to hurt you. If he's getting pressured a lot, it can be a problem for him. Well, the pocket passer doesn't concern me as much for Notre Dame's defense as the mobile guy. Now, for other teams, that may not be the case, and they may be more worried about Indiana than they are SMU. That's really what it comes down to, is what has given Notre Dame problems this year. It's that athletic dual threat quarterback, which kind of gives everybody problems, if we're being honest, right? And we saw that with Clemson. I mean, if it's not for an early turnover and then you have the short punt and then the penalty at the end of that and Clemson jumps up on 14-0, how does that game look if they don't have those big mistakes? And we saw once that offense got going, there was really not a whole lot Clemson can do in the fourth quarter of that game to stop that SMU offense. And that's just kind of how I look at it, Mark. Like, I don't have any doubt that if that game goes to overtime, that's a that's probably a 1 overtime game, because Clemson had already kind of turned the lights off a little bit, and we're not going to be able to turn that back on. And SMU was like, now we're rolling. So that's really it's the matchup. It's not that I think SMU's better than Indiana. It's just how do they match up against Notre Dame?
Yeah, that fourth quarter against Clemson was mighty impressive for SMU to pull that together and get back in the game. But Clemson made 3 plays. They got a kickoff. They got 1 square in shot. And then the 56-yard kick that I certainly didn't see coming. I didn't know that kicker was capable of that.
Had some adrenaline flowing for that one, buddy. You know he did.
Absolutely. So when you see this Indiana team, what games, and I don't know if you've finished your work on Indiana because the game is still 10 days away, and we can dig in, hopefully if we get you next week, a little deeper.
I plan to be with
your
you
initial thoughts, what games, I would think you gravitate to Ohio State because that's the team from a talent perspective that's on Notre Dame's level that you would want to see that game.
I broke that game down, but I also view that as a bit of an anomaly game. And I always try to say, like people say, well, Notre Dame's pass defense isn't really that good. Well, what makes you say that? Well, the USC game. Well, every team kind of, if you look to their worst game of the year, you're going to think that, okay, I think Ohio State is a very mediocre football team. Well, what makes you say that? Because I watched them against Michigan.
Sure.
Well, is that it? Well, no, I watched them against Oregon too. Was that it? Yep, that's it. Oh, well, yeah, sure. You know what I mean? If the only time you ever watched Tom Brady in Super Bowl was against the Giants, you're going to think he's not that great of a quarterback. You know what I mean? So I look at that game and I evaluate that game. You look at the athletic mismatches, but I always kind of look, what are the 2-3 best games they played, and what are the couple worst games that they played, and try to evaluate all those. So right now I'm kind of working through the Nebraska game. I'm working through the Michigan State game. I'm working through the UCLA game. I'm also going to watch the Michigan and the Ohio State games and breaking them down. And I'll tell you, I like what I see so far. This is a good football team. I think the Ohio State game was just one of those games where Ohio State just had their number that day. And I just think sometimes we can overreact too much to like one game. And I'll use Ohio State example. Do we really think that if Ohio State and Florida would have played in a rematch a week after the 2006 title game, that it would have still been a blowout like that? No, it probably would have been a much more competitive game. Maybe Ohio State wins. I try not to get wrapped up in how they looked at one game, especially when it was way different than everything they did that entire year. But I do think those 2 games in a row are something you can take from that, which is that's the first time they really played really good defenses and good lines in back-to-back games. And there's a reason they struggled in those games, because they're big on the offensive line, they're experienced, but they're not really athletic. And those 2 defensive lines gave them some problems. Michigan, actually, they were working Michigan a little bit early, and then Michigan kind of found some answers and was able to shut them down and make that game more competitive. But that's the big thing, is they're a really good football team, Mark. I don't know that they're great anywhere. They're just really well coached. They're really confident. And even though there's nowhere where I think they're elite, I don't know that there's anywhere that I think they're bad either. And there's other teams with like major holes here, major holes there. This is a really good football team, and they've taken on the personality of their head coach. They play very arrogantly, and I mean that in a compliment, because they weren't afraid of Ohio State. I mean, they went right down the field on Ohio State that first drive. It's just after a while. And also that was, I think, the second game without their starting left guard, which I think hurt them a little bit too. They struggled with some line games in there. Drew Evans had gotten hurt. I think his first start, was the Michigan game, and then Ohio State. And I think they struggled a little bit with that. They'll have more time to clean some of that up with Tyler Stevens now getting a little bit extra time. It's just one of those days where that wasn't their day. It's like, I'm like, well, that's who they really are. Okay, we're going to say that about Notre Dame? Is that who they really are when they played Northern Illinois? Is that really who Notre Dame is? You had your best day. So I tried to break down a lot of the other games and say, okay, what do I see that translates against Notre Dame? What can they do to maybe give Notre Dame some problems? And what are some areas where I think Notre Dame can take advantage in ways that the rest of the league just couldn't? Because, but can we be honest about something too, Mark? People act like this Indiana team is a super talented team and just out-talented all these other teams in the Big Ten. No, they're talented, but they're not that talented. That's an incredibly well-coached, disciplined, confident football team that, to me, plays a little bit above their talent level this year. And I mean that as a compliment, not as a, well, they're not that talented. I mean that as like I said this in our show, they're a bunch of really good group of 5 players Like it's kind of like a group of 5 all-star team that play with a group of 5 chip on their shoulder. And that's made them a really, really good football team in the Big Ten this year.
Yeah, in that Ohio State game, I don't think anyone else that we would argue that Ohio State's not decidedly better, but when your punter muffs a snap, that's a gift of a touchdown at a crucial part in the game that pretty much broke their backs.
I think that game's probably a 24-13 game, a 21-13 game if it's not for the special teams miscues. Because the reality is, say what you want about the special teams, Indiana wasn't moving the ball on Ohio State. But to Indiana's credit on their defense also didn't give up 38 points either. You know, and I think that's what made that game look a lot more lopsided. Because like we're talking about this today, it's a 14-7 game at halftime, and Ohio State scored with less than a minute left to make it 14-7. It wasn't like they just came out and steamrolled them for 60 minutes, you know, like Notre Dame did to Army. It wasn't that kind of blowout win. It was a game that was a lot more competitive than the final score would have dictated. But to your point, Ohio State was clearly still the better football team that day because they just ate Indiana up with their defensive line and linebacker games were just eating Indiana up, and there's nothing they could do about it.
You see here on this banner, we've got our buddies Jeffrey and Will getting together tonight. They want to mix it up with all of you, so they're doing a little call-in show at 10 p.m. Eastern time right here. Catch Brian, of course, every day at 1 p.m. Eastern time on Irish Breakdown. And hopefully, Brian, we get you back next week. We could talk a little more Kurt Signetti. We can talk matchups in regards to this game. But we'll let you get on your way. We appreciate you being here. Know you've had a long day. Thanks so much for showing up for us, and we can break down the matchup
I'll
next
have
week.
A lot more film watching under my belt. This is a good football team. I'll say this, Mark, to leave it this. I think that these, for all my beefs with I would have seeded it here, I really do like these 4 matchups in the playoffs. I do. I like the Ohio State-Tennessee matchup. I think that's going to be a really interesting game. I actually like the Penn State-SMU game. I think there's some areas where each team can give each other some problems. And, I mean, the Texas-Clemson game is not as appealing because I just don't know how that Clemson's that good. But Texas has got some major question marks right now at the quarterback position as far as the health of the mind and body of Quinn Ewers right now. So, it's going to be a very interesting game. I can't wait to really see that first round. It's going to be a blast. And I'm just happy that Notre Dame's playing on Friday. So on Saturday, I can just sit back and relax and watch football and not have to worry about driving to the stadium or anything like that. I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, it's a nice little setup where we get a Friday game where most people will, of course, work on Friday, you get one game, and then the big triple header on Saturday's nice. Absolutely. Brian, appreciate you being here. Have a great rest of your week. Hopefully we can get together next week.
Look forward to it.
This 10 p.m. Eastern time call-in show, folks. So you can make it on back here in 90 minutes with Will and Jeffrey, and you can slice and dice this matchup with those two just here in 90 minutes.